That was awesome, wasn't it? A friend of mine told me today that when the music is playing at the beginning and I talk, he can't hear what I'm saying. So maybe the music's been too high. I started the music, but there was some latency on the broadcast starting, so the music was already rolling instead of it starting all at the same time. Rookie move, Nyxx. I'm going to be replaced on my own show. I'm really looking forward to tonight's show. I've got a tremendous guest. This is episode number 50, believe it or not. And last time he was on, it was episode number 22. But first, I just want to say hello to everyone. I did want to say hello to the professor who should be in the chat room. And I wanted to say if C.W. Chanter shows up, he has been showing up, someone give him a wrench. I always forget about that because I don't keep a close eye on that all the time. But yeah, if CW shows up, give CW a wrench. And speaking of which, I was setting my equipment up for the show, and I saw Kelly Farmer with CW Chanter in person on what I take to be CW's show. And I was scratching my head, but I was in the process of setting all this up. So I'm going to have to watch that episode and see what's going on. I have ducked out of all the drama on social media. I kind of ducked out of Facebook and Twitter. I'm reintegrating myself, but I had just kind of gotten filled up to here with a lot of the drama and stuff. And so I just kind of took a break from all that. But I'm refreshed and I'm back. And it is Friday, April 19th. Tomorrow's 4/20. And it is 2019, of course. I have a guest coming up next month that I want to mention. And it's the reason I mention him, his name is Aaron Ra. And his channel on YouTube is all one word, ARONRA, Aaron Ra. And he's an atheist. And he's associated with this larger movement of atheists. And I've been watching some atheist videos, and their logic and their reasoning is airtight, and they're pretty brutal in their assessments. But I look forward to having him on because I've had some pretty woo-woo stuff on the show from time to time. And I think for honesty and balance, I think I should bring an atheist on and hear their point of view. And you might be shocked. In spite of the content of this show, I'm probably about 75% atheist, but 25% of me holds on to some unexplained, scientifically based metaphysical web underlying the universe or the nature of reality. So I still hold 25% out for that, but it's going to be fascinating. And I have to do homework when I have tonight's guest on, who is Laird Scranton. And that's what led me into talking about Aaron Ra, because I have to do my homework when I talk to those guys too. And I think when I have guests on that I have to actually do some studying to interview, I think that means a good show is coming. And I think that's where we're at tonight. Laird Scranton is a comparative cosmologist. And if you're watching this show, most likely you don't even really need to know who he is because you already know. But I'm going to tell you anyway. I'm going to skim over just a few of the titles of his books. And he's published by Inner Traditions. And you can go to their website to find his catalog of books. But just to skim over just a few: Hidden Meanings, Science of the Dogon, China's Cosmological Prehistory, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon. And if you don't know, if this is your introduction to Mr. Scranton's work, the Dogon people are a modern primitive African tribe. They have a language that's undefinable in a certain sense. There are 19 subgroups of their language. It's a very complex issue. And we talked about that in episode 22. So if you want to know about the Dogon people, go back in the Mysterious Forces lineup, find episode 22, and you'll hear all about that there. But tonight, we're going to move on to newer topics, and we'd like to keep it fresh. So without any further ado, please welcome Laird Scranton to the show. Laird, thank you for being here tonight.
Hey, Natasha. Thank you very much for having me on again. I appreciate it. I've been looking forward to it.
No, it's great. You landed on episode 50, and things are so much better with the show. I'm doing a lot better job than I had been doing around episode 22, and we've really found our groove, and we've got quite a bit bigger audience now than we did. So
Oh,
the
that's
show's
great.
been
Practice
growing.
makes perfect. That's great.
It does. It does. So I hope that your 2019 is going well. And
So
I
far,
can.
it's going pretty well.
That's
Sorry.
good. Oh no, that I don't normally do this. I have to take a drink of water, and I can tell. I could just tell that I was going to have issues if I didn't get some water. Excuse me for that. That's what you don't see on mainstream television right there. So, what I was excited to talk to you about, and we spoke briefly before we went on air about this, but this recent discovery in the Philippines, Homo Luzonensis, which, for the sake of the audience, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to refer to that species as H. Luzonensis from this point forward, but it's Homo Luzonensis. These remains, these fossils were found on the island of Luzon. And the time period for these peoples is a minimum of 50,000 years ago to 67,000 years ago. And what led them to not create, but I suppose brand this new branch, this new species, they found 7 teeth and small bones. And it's further added more to the picture of the diversity of ancient hominids. And these people were tool makers, they were hunters, and they too were of small stature, much like another species that was found in the Philippine Islands in the last 5 years, I believe. And I think a lot of the researchers are leaning towards the idea that these species were small due to their island environments. And I'm just wondering, I know that there's not a lot of micro detail on this topic yet because this is a new discovery, a new branch. And there's not a lot of hardcore research that can be done. But I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to the overarching field of anthropology and what a new discovery in 2019 means to anthropology.
Well, yes, that's not really my field of study, and it dates from a period that's quite a bit earlier than most of the work that I've done. But it's of interest to me because small-statured people or reports of them go hand in hand with ancient cosmology. Wherever you go, you find reports of pygmies. As far away as New Zealand, in Africa, even in the British Isles, there are examples. So it's always of interest to me when they come across another example. I'm amazed that they can determine from as few bones as they have that they're dealing with a different branch of the family than they previously seen before. I know that the research they're doing is complicated. I think 50 years ago they would have thought that the history was going to play out a lot more directly, a lot more straightforwardly than it is. And by the time they're done, who knows how many dozens of different varieties of humanoid species they're going to have that are descendant or we're descendants of, or how they're ever going to determine which one was the main path.
Do you think that's the logical result of the mechanism of evolution, that there would have been these other branches that perhaps weren't complete failures? Some traits might have carried over into DNA that helped kind of perfect Homo sapiens at a later time, but were successful for that time and that place.
Yeah,
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I know that disasters have global disasters have a tendency to cause many species to go extinct. And so, if you get an isolated species on an island, that happened not to go extinct during the disaster, then they develop their own path of evolution, essentially, or they preserve a path that maybe it would have died out otherwise, or would have intermarried otherwise. But no, it's interesting to me that they're able to produce this. I haven't really worked with hands-on archaeology or anthropology that way. My research is all related to symbolism and to philosophies of creation.
Understood. That was my mistake for kind of muddling those
No, no, that's okay.
disciplines up. You know, like I minored in cultural anthropology, and in my mind, a lot of this stuff runs together because there's so many crossover points in this kind of information and this research. And something that producer Michael brought up, and I thought maybe we would touch on this. He had talked about a genetic connection between Aborigines, the Maori, Denisovans, and connections between North and South American DNA, ancient DNA that's been found. Can we trace any links from these more remote locations to the Americas?
Well, in terms of the studies I do, I see connections on both ends of the historical spectrum. Coming out of the 9000 BC era in the Fertile Crescent region, we see the symbolic system that I'm tracing, and the civilizing plan that I'm tracing out sort of in all directions, radiating outward from Turkey or from Western Iraq. And one of the paths that it flows through is through Siberia and Mongolia, through China, towards the east. And we see direct connections across the Bering Strait into North America. The most obvious one I see is through structures called yurts, which you're probably familiar with. A yurt is symbolically a portable stupa shrine, a Buddhist stupa shrine. It's the same form as far as I'm concerned, in that it preserves a lot of the same structural elements and alignments and all of the same symbolism. So there are actually 4 different variety of yurt. The largest variety is a structural and symbolic match for a Navajo roundhouse in North America. Okay. The smallest of them, the most portable one, is called the teepee, and it's a structural and symbolic match for a Native American teepee. So you have both of those forms seemingly carried over from Asia into North America at whatever point those appear in North America. Genetically, I know that the migrations into North America are more complicated than they expected they were going to be, and there are pieces of the genetics that they have not yet accounted for. They can trace contributions that came across the Bering Strait. They can trace contributions that seemingly came up from the south, and there is at least one other element of the DNA that they have not been able to identify. Where did it come from? Where did it originate? How did it end up in North America?
Do you think that ancient peoples were seafaring at an earlier time period than what's generally accepted? Or do you think that the accepted dogma of academia is correct?
Well, we can see based on DNA and genetics that seafaring people from the Fertile Crescent region had made their way out to Gibraltar by about 8000 BC. So someone was skilled at seafaring, at building boats, at navigating waters, and so forth by 8000 BC. And if they were able to make it out to the Bering Strait, out to Gibraltar, from there are all sorts of directions they could have gone. If they hooked up with an ocean current, they could get to South America. Through the middle of the Atlantic, with the North Atlantic current, they could have gotten up to the British Isles and so forth. And how early that happened, it's hard to say. The surviving evidence makes it look like they got there by around 4000 BC, but it may have been earlier.
Do you think that we have lost valuable evidence? I know that there are, and I'm not claiming that it's Atlantis or anything in particular, but there are obviously, it's a fact, ancient ruins on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. There are stone roads, parts of temples, there are stairs. It's down by the Bahamas. And right. There are also examples of temples on the floor in Greece and in that area where there was more land at one time, and they had severe earthquakes. So they had geological changes. Have we lost a lot of the important evidence to these ancient peoples, do you think, through a lot of these ancient cultures having been subsumed into the ocean rather than us having access to them?
I'm sure there's quite a lot that we don't see that if we were able to look under the water just off the coastland of places like India, we're going to know that off of Japan there are ruins that some researchers feel are man-made, others feel are natural. And there's debate among geologists as to is what we are looking at actually a man-made structure. Sometimes nature produces things that are very regular shapes, very regular forms, and without something more overt than, say, what looks like a staircase. If you came across a statue, you could, or something like that, or an object carved in stone, then you could say, yes, absolutely, this is human work. But that's not always the case.
Right.
I think a lot of it is buried off the shores of the various continents. If we could get proper equipment under the water, they could discover all sorts of things.
Right. And of course, Plato made reference to Atlantis. Do you give any credence to the actual places of Atlantis or Lemuria or other places like that are discussed? Do you think those places actually existed, or do you think that they kind of became the collective mythology of the cultural consciousness?
Well, I have two perspectives on that. First of all, when the ancient Egyptians talk about a first time, a mythical first time, the Buddhists talk about the first time that knowledge was passed to humanity from a Buddha. The Dogon talk about a time when humanity was restored to culture. So the Dogon perspective implies that there was high culture sometime earlier than we have historic memory of. I trust what the Dogons say. That's an indicator to me that also common sense says, we have visibility on about 12,000 years of human history that goes back at least 200,000 years. So how many 12,000 year cycles do you have in there when what we see right now might potentially have developed? It's hard to believe that anatomically modern humans were sitting around doing nothing for that long a period of time. Right. The other perspective is that the word mu in some of the ancient languages refers to ancestors. So when some of the ancient cultures talk about mu, it's equivocal whether they're talking about a place that existed or a civilization that existed, or whether they're actually just talking about ancestors.
Right, kind of like a dream time for the Aborigines, an analog.
Right. And so even though you have multiple cultures talking about mu, I'm not in a position to definitively say what they mean when they say that. They could all be using the same word and not be referring to common civilization. I personally think that there was high civilization prior to the end of the Ice Age, or prior to the beginning of the Ice Age. The Ice Age acts as an effective block on evidence. It's very hard to trace anything past that block.
I see. I don't mean to jump around so much. I know that I was pretty linear in our first episode, but I was so intrigued with your work that I have come up with a more diverse set of questions. So I'm going to subject hop a little bit here.
Okay.
And I wonder if you can comment on the damage that has been done to your work and the work of cultural anthropologists, and with all of the wars and destruction that has happened in the Middle East, and so many shrines and temples have been destroyed, do you think that there are some pieces of this puzzle, this chain of civilization? Do you think that we'll ever be able to really piece it all together, or has this research in some areas been irreparably damaged by human intervention and conflict?
Well, it's a shame all of it has been lost, and some of it hasn't just been through warfare. I mean, when they built the Aswan Dam in Egypt, an entire region south of Egypt was covered over, and there could be, any amount of evidence there underneath the waters that we no longer have access to. Some of these steps were taken in ways that it's hard not to suspect might have been deliberate. I see in some situations what look like deliberate attempts by modern people to disguise certain things. I don't think that so much has been lost that we aren't going to be able to trace what's true already based just on the narrow field of study that I pursue. I have a pretty good sense of where things most likely lie. I mean, there are a lot of aspects of the history that have to be the way a particular way because the way the pieces fit together, they don't fit another way. So I'm not too concerned about individual destruction through individual wars in the Middle East and elsewhere damaging more than just a small, portion of what we have overall.
Okay, all right, that's good. That's good. As if your research is rock solid. I was just laughing at myself as if your research needs my approval. That's good.
Well, as a corollary to that, we have huge underground libraries in places like Timbuktu. I know that similar hidden libraries exist in India. I know people who've been in them where thousands or hundreds of thousands of ancient scrolls with written information exist and are carefully cared for and copied as they deteriorate. So there's a wealth. There are rumors that there are libraries like that in Egypt. Supposedly there was one buried near the Sphinx. These libraries are going to turn up, and when they do, there'll be a wealth of knowledge that, if we're able to translate it, is going to provide us with a lot of history.
That's a great segue, and I agree. That's a great segue into a topic I wanted to bring up. And when I was in 5th or 6th grade, I remember 6th grade in particular, and I'm 53 now. I remember the first time that King Tut and a lot of the paraphernalia from his tomb came through the United States on a tour of a variety of museums. And I grew up in the Midwest, and of course the Museum of Natural History, Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago had King Tut's exhibit for a while. And it's the Steve Martin song and all the hubbub of around that time. But I really absorbed that quite heavily as a kid, and it really influenced me. And in 6th grade, like at that time in my life, I was like, I want to grow up to become an Egyptologist. Like, I was just absolutely fascinated. And I want to ask you some questions about ancient Egypt. And if some of these questions stray outside the boundaries of your wheelhouse, just let me know.
Well, don't worry, I'll just make something up. No problem.
Awesome. You heard it here first. No. He makes it up as he goes along. No. And this is kind of a weird, this might almost be kind of a pop culture kind of a question. And I don't mean it to be, I don't know. I'm not being flippant by asking this. The ancient Egyptians, their hieroglyphics and their art and their monuments are so lavish and so over the top, so intricate. And obviously their mythology was very complex, and their language even was sophisticated. In real life, in day-to-day life, were they really as made up as what we see? I mean, I know that Hollywood and movies want to portray a very dramatic look of ancient Egypt, but were they really dressing that way, wearing the makeup, the big headdresses? I mean, I could see if that was for special occasions, but I'm talking about the day-to-day, the royalty, the priesthood. Were they sporting that stuff all the time? Were they really that? Was that their culture on a day-to-day basis?
Well, you think of human nature, in the modern day, most people don't take photographs and post them. Say back in the day when you would keep photo albums, you wouldn't make a photo album of your family sitting around in their shorts and their sweatshirts necessarily, unless you were on vacation. What normally gets recorded in photography and in modern day art are the special events. the events where someone would get dressed up, where they would be doing something that's out of the ordinary. So I think the same thing was true in ancient Egypt, that they were trying to document in as meticulous a way as they could things that were really important to their religious tradition, to their special events for their pharaohs and their culture. And so I'm sure we have it's an idealized vision of what life was actually like. I'm lucky in that the Dogon tribe preserves many of the civic practices of ancient Egypt as they looked around 3000 BC. And so the Dogon sort of provide us with the opposite end of the spectrum on that. If the Egyptian end is perfection, the Dogon end is everyday life, and it's far less romanticized, far less romantic. I mean, there are chickens running around the courtyards of little villages and mud huts, and the sorts of everyday life that our grandparents used to see on the farm, not pharaohs being carried on litters.
Right. So I'm just fascinated with the ancient Egyptian preoccupation with the afterlife. And it seemed like they put maybe even more effort into preparation for the afterlife than what they were spending on living in the here and the now. Can you speak to that psychology? Do you know anything about that? Were they really in that headspace? Or is that just a perception from the 21st century?
From my perspective, what's at the heart of the Egyptian culture, as it is in the Dogon culture, is a symbolic cosmology that's talking about non-materiality and materiality. Now, it's hard to separate discussions of non-materiality from discussions of death. But scientifically speaking, speaking in relation to the idea of processes of creation, what that's really talking about is what the other side of the coin is to material structures. Modern researchers who are not in the mindset of thinking about things in terms of cosmology may sometimes mistake discussions of cosmology for discussions of afterlife.
Okay.
But talk about life and death was one of the metaphors by which they discussed that. They also discussed it in terms of metaphors of day and night. Day represented material creation, and the nighttime represented the non-material processes. And they had a whole host of different metaphors that way, by which they could put into familiar terms for somebody some very complicated concepts they were trying to get people to understand. So I tend to look at discussions of what happens to the pharaoh when he dies, or what happens to his soul when he dies, on several different levels of understanding. On one level, they're talking about cosmology. On the other hand, there are signs that they were talking about the journey that the pharaoh's soul makes. They're talking about some geography that looks real to me. In ancient Greece, they had similar concepts. One thing we can say with certainty about ancient Greece is anytime they were talking about geography, whoever was discussing it was telling us the truth about it. That's why Schliemann was able to go out and actually find the mythical city of Troy, because they were not fooling around when they were talking about geography. The scenes they were describing, the points of reference that they were giving were legitimate cartography in terms of how to get to the place. The ancient Egyptians, in many cases for me, are doing the same thing. The descriptions they're giving of where things are in relation to Egypt and how that journey is made from Egypt after the death of the pharaoh ties in, on one level of understanding, to real geography. That's hard to explain, but that's how I see it. It's not always what the researchers believe it is.
Right. No. And it's easy for me to believe. Absolutely. When they were building temples and they were creating art and leaving this rich amount of cultural data, if you will. Were they creating that and leaving that in accordance with their religious beliefs? Or do you think that they had a larger perspective and were in some sense creating a time capsule for the people of the future to know them and remember them, and in some way perhaps get a certain kind of immortality for their culture by leaving such a heavy footprint, so to speak?
Well, I see a couple of different things going on. In my field of study, the critical thing that was going on is that it looks as if way back when, someone who understood how very complicated concepts of scientific creation happen found ways of explaining that aimed at a technologically minded audience in the future, and was trying to convey that information forward. There are some compelling reasons why they would want to, more than I can adequately explain in the amount of time we have. But it looks to me as if very many ancient cultures received instruction in this system of creation, talking about how matter forms, how the universe forms, and how biological reproduction happens. So from culture to culture, there's a great deal of effort put into trying to preserve that, trying to record it, trying to find ways of passing it forward that we're going to hold coherence for thousands of years. So that's one piece of what's going on with Egyptian art for me. Another piece has to do with the aggrandizement of pharaohs, that over time, what started out to be a system of what looked like very little ego grew into a system of quite a lot of ego. We've seen that happen in various aspects of our own culture, where someone gets to think a little too much of themselves, and now suddenly it's about personal aggrandizement. It's not about trying to do something noble or serious for a culture. So. Right. I think that a lot of the art, a lot of the grandiose temples and so forth had as much to do with ego as they had to do with anything else. So you have a number of different motives going into ancient Egyptian art and evidence that we see recorded. It's interesting to compare that to what is left behind in some of the other cultures, like in the United Kingdom in northern Scotland. We have a real paucity of evidence, very slim evidence to work from, that has compelling ways of tying to what we see in Egypt, but not presented in any of the same way at all, and not preserved in any of the same way. And without an overview of how these pieces fit together, it's not even commonly possible to identify that one piece goes with the other piece. Right. That's part of what my work is about, is trying to get enough of an overview to be able to notice that, hey, when the Maori in New Zealand are doing a particular thing, it's the same thing that the Shakti cult in India was doing in an earlier period.
Right. Yeah. And I'm being distracted because I am home alone and I have no one to wrangle my dogs, and I have a dog barking in my kitchen, and I think he's starting to howl. And so I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you, and I'm hearing a dog howl in my kitchen. I don't know if the audience can hear that, but if you can, I'm home alone and there's no one to wrangle the dogs. So it is what it is tonight.
That's okay. I often evoke that response in dogs. No problem.
I'm listening to you. I'm hanging on your every word, and I'm hearing this dog. I'm like, oh my God. So anyway, so we'll work through it. Is pyramid building the outward manifestation, or maybe the most outwardly obvious connection between this? Are the pyramid builders of South America, Egypt, and other locations connected culturally or nomadically somehow? Or did different civilizations in different eras somehow spontaneously conceive of the pyramid as this step or reach towards heaven?
The simple view of this is, and a lot of researchers look at it this way, is that any culture whose primary building material is stone, it's only a matter of time before they think to stack those stones up in the form of a pyramid. There are not very many things you can do with stones. Okay. So it's 100% thinkable that widely divergent culture or distant cultures would think to create a pyramid structure just by coincidence.
Okay.
The problem is that those structures connect to symbolism that is not intuitive at all. That it's not. There are symbolic meanings associated with these pyramids that no person in their right mind would just guess coincidentally. That you have a pyramid that, on one level of understanding, symbolizes a woman lying on her back. It's symbolic of a womb. On another level of understanding, the faces of the pyramids are associated with star groups that regulate the agricultural cycle. You have a whole host of very diverse symbolic meanings that turn up again and again and again associated with the same structural forms. Now that says to me it can't possibly be coincidence. It has to have come out of a common influence. And when you get to the bottom of what these cultures themselves say was that original influence, it gives the appearance that there was an instructed system that they were all influenced by. Actually, some of the cultures flatly say it. The Dogon flatly say it. The Buddhists flatly say it. Other cultures say it in certain ways. The ancient Egyptians say that their written language was gifted to them by their gods. That's instructed knowledge. You have similar threads all over the world of cultures saying, this piece of what we know was a gift to us from people we thought were gods. The Dogon had the sense, the presence of mind to ask their teachers, "Are you God?" And their teachers said, "No, we're not God. But if you want to think of it, if it's helpful to you to think of us as gods, think of us as agents of God. But truth is, we're not God." Now we know that from watching science fiction that that's the rookie mistake. When someone asks you, "Are you God?" and you're an alien, or whoever you happen to be, you're a superior intellect. The right answer is you say, "Yes, of course I'm God," and that gives you all sorts of power. So the fact that the Dogon teachers fessed up to the fact that they weren't gods says to me that they were the real deal. They were not. They were telling us straight what the story was. They were not putting on pretense.
Right. No, that's a good clue. That's an excellent point. And this is, I'm going to ask one completely random ancient Egypt question, and we'll switch gears a little bit. Okay. Is there anyone around now that can speak the language of ancient Egypt? Is it possible to hear the language spoken, or is it completely dead?
Well, first of all, no one's sure how any of the words were actually pronounced because, like ancient Hebrew and some other languages, they didn't write down the vowel sounds. Now, that seems a little hard to understand, given that the official perspective is that this was a phonetic language like English, that the letters represented sounds. If someone were trying to represent things phonetically, it's a no-brainer that they would write down the vowel sounds. You can't pronounce the words right without them.
Right.
In New Zealand, they speak English, but they have the audacity to change the sound of two vowel sounds from how we speak it in the United States. And though that difference is enough to render the language almost unintelligible to someone who hasn't tuned their ear to it. So, in fact, the leaving out of those vowel sounds has a symbolic rationale behind it. There's a reason why all of these ancient symbolic languages did that. Part of the reason was to be able to disguise what they were actually saying. There's nobody now who can even tell you with certainty how any given word was pronounced. They can infer it, like the word amen in ancient Egypt. We have dozens of cultures that had connections to ancient Egypt, and we know how some of them pronounce the word, and so we can infer from that. But you go to Ethiopia and they pronounce it Eman, not Amen. So even there you have some wiggle room. So the easy answer is no, there's nobody who can tell us with certainty what ancient Egyptian language sounded like, the written language sounded like. All they can do is compare to word forms that followed Egypt, like in ancient Greece, or word forms that were contemporaneous or preceded ancient Egypt, like words that come out of Africa, and make the best guess as to here's how the word was probably pronounced.
Okay, cool. That was my time rookie question. That was I wasn't really asking for the show. I was asking for me. That came to me while I was researching for this episode. Now let's get into some real meat and potatoes in our last 20 minutes.
Okay.
I'd like to talk about, and this is the title of one of your books, The Mystery of Skara Brae.
Okay.
And I was wondering if you could just lay that on the audience and kind of outline that for us.
Okay, as I said, Skara Brae is considered to be the first farming village in the United Kingdom. It dates from sometime prior to 3200 BC, which means it's before ancient Egypt. Dynastic Egypt appears sometime after 3000 BC. So it's a couple of hundred years before ancient Egypt. I didn't know much about it until an acquaintance emailed me a question about it, wanting to know if I saw Egyptian influences there. Well, I knew that 3200 BC is a bit too early to imagine that anyone in ancient Egypt could have mounted an expedition to Scotland and set up house there. So my initial feeling was that couldn't be the answer. We couldn't be seeing Egyptian influences there. Once I started researching it, what I discovered was there's not very much evidence to work with. You have architecture, you have some megalithic structures that these farmers were building in their spare time. Actually, some magnificent megalithic structures. They're actually precursors to things like Stonehenge. This is where the stonemasonry tradition in the United Kingdom began. You have language, you have some myths and some folk tales, and you have a handful of artifacts, not anything close to what you find in ancient Egypt in terms of evidence. Okay. So working with what I had, I started examining this little farming village and discovered that the 8 chambers, the 8 houses that were originally in this farming village, the original ones were all built to a single plan. That plan was an odd plan. It's so odd that the researchers there can't connect it to anything locally in terms of Scandinavia or nearby Europe. It has a round room on one end that researchers describe as a beehive cell shape. You have a central room that's square, 2 side rooms that are rectangular, and a bottom room, which is the entry to the building, which is also basically rectangular. So it's built out of drywall stone. This is flat stones that were stacked up to create a house. Okay. And they buried it in midden. It was surrounded by debris and dirt and things that helped to insulate it. So grasping at straws, I knew that the era of 3000 BC is when it looks like the Dogon were Egyptians. So I thought if I was going to find commonalities with Egypt, I might find them preserved with the Dogon in Africa, the modern day Dogon, because they've done everything they can to preserve original forms. So I did some research. The Dogon normally build their houses out of mud, but occasionally they build them out of stone. And when they build them out of stone, they use a drywall construction method, and they build it to the same basic plan that the Skara Brae houses have. But the difference is the Dogon say they do that for a reason. They do it because the house plan has cosmological symbolism to it. It represents something. What it represents for them is a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. The round room on one end is her head. The side rooms are her arms. The central room is her body cavity. And the entryway room are her sexual parts. Okay. So once I made that connection, the door was now open. Since nobody else has a connection to the Skara Brae architecture, the door was open for me to now consider everything else I saw on Orkney Island in terms of Dogon cosmology and Dogon language. If you go to this series of megalithic stone sites that exist on Orkney, they're set out in a sequence that was connected by a road in ancient times and Neolithic times that led right to that Skara Brae village. I noticed that those are not just random structures or random shapes. It's a sequence of structures that are recognizable as the Dogon, essentially alphabet of creation for matter. These are geometric shapes, a progression of geometric shapes by which matter emerges scientifically. Okay. Built to a human scale with a road connecting them that a person could walk through. Now, it doesn't take a lot of brain power to figure out that someone was instructing cosmology on Orkney at 3200 BC. And it also looks as if they were instructing farming. Well, the Dogons say that in ancient times, they were given instruction in cosmology and in farming at a remote location. So do any number of other cultures. So I was beginning to imagine that I had stumbled on one of those locales where that instruction had been given.
I see.
Once I understood that, then I could start applying, comparing language, comparing words, names of places. On Orkney, they have theories as to why certain things are named certain ways, and the linguists have made connections to certain words, and they say, well, it looks like as if this was named such and such because of such and such. If you compare the names to ancient Egyptian words and ancient Dogon words, which are quite often the same word forms, you discover a sensible reason why that particular spot was named what it was named based on those Dogon and Egyptian words. In other words, you get a rational explanation for why, not just a theory as to what. Okay. And so my book, The Mystery of Skara Brae, tries to lay all that out. Now, originally I thought I was seeing Egyptian connections or Dogon connections to Orkney. One of the differences in the house plan is that on Orkney, in the center of that main room, they have a square hearth where they had a fire. In the Dogon house, they don't. The main room has no hearth. Well, that makes sense because I thought, isn't it interesting if the Dogon plan was original, that when they adapted it to Orkney where the weather's colder, they thought to put the hearth in just where it should be to represent the heart of the sleeping woman. I thought that's amazing that they were aware enough of the symbolism that they did that. Mm-hmm. It finally occurred to me that I was looking at things backwards, that the Orkney form was the original form, and the Dogon form moved into a subtropical climate, simply took the hearth out and moved it into the town square, sort of, because it was so warm they didn't need a fireplace inside their house.
Got it.
So once you start looking at it from that reverse perspective, then suddenly you start to see connections that made all sorts of sense to ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, in the first dynasty, we have burial chambers that are understood to have represented houses that take the same shape, same architectural form as the Dogon and the Skara Brae house. As a matter of fact, one of the first, I think King Narmer, one of the earliest known kings in ancient Egypt, his burial chamber is built to that plan. So that book was basically trying to find methods of connecting those elements together. When you step back from the broader perspective, you realize that on Orkney, you've got a handful, half a dozen or more elements on Orkney that tie positively to the Fertile Crescent region at about 6,000 BC. You have a variety of barley called six-row barley that they've tested the DNA. They know that it came from the Fertile Crescent region sometime prior to 6,000 BC or after 6,000 BC. You have a variety of sheep, same thing. DNA testing shows it came from there. You've got a variety of deer. They've tested the DNA and proved that it could not have possibly come, red deer that could not have possibly come from anywhere nearby Orkney. It had to have been transported by boat, by sea, from a distance. Well, you have the same variety of deer in the Fertile Crescent region at 6,000 BC. You've got a burial tradition on Orkney where researchers interpreted it as being a period of warfare on Orkney because all the skulls were opened at the top. But you go to the Fertile Crescent region and you discover it's a known burial tradition of the Shakti cult with ritualistic reasons why they open the top of the skull. Actually, it's a comparable reason goes hand in hand with the opening of the mouth of the mummies in Egypt in a later era. The idea was to allow the soul to ascend on Orkney. In Egypt, the idea was to allow the soul to be reborn through the mouth. So you have all of these different elements that tie positively that say again and again, look, folks, what we see on Orkney originally came from the Fertile Crescent region.
Which so much came from there. Like,
right. It makes sense.
Yeah.
And there are actually ways to trace it. One of the manuscripts I have yet to write that's probably next on my list is to tie those connections together to show here's how it got from the Fertile Crescent region to Orkney, and more than that, here's why it got there.
Wow. So is it fair to say that not in all cases, but commonly, the architecture style of a culture is not only shaped by its environment, which I would have, if I were to guess, I would have said environment would dictate your shelter.
Right.
But you're saying that not only is that a factor, but also a culture's belief system is also integrated into the architecture, and that those are subtle clues to that culture that, say, kind of like the ignorant Western mind doesn't really perceive on face value.
Yes, and more than subtle a lot of times. For example, in there are two eras to the cosmology, the symbolic tradition that I'm exploring. There's an archaic era, and there's a more recently modern era, and the dividing line is about the era of Orkney, about 3200 BC or just after. Now, prior to, in the archaic times, the figure of a circle was symbolic of the Earth. Or at least we find it structures built on circular bases that sit on the Earth. In the later era, you find square structures symbolic of the Earth, sitting on the Earth. And so the Dogon have an aligned granary shrine. And it's an aligned shrine they build that's comparable to a Buddhist stupa shrine. As a matter of fact, it's a symbolic match and in many ways an architectural match. The difference is the Dogon shrine culminates in a round base, which says to me it's the archaic form. The Buddhist shrine most typically culminates in a squared base, which says to me it's the later form. Okay. And so you can at least do rough placement of era for architecture based on factors like that, if you know what those factors are. So yes, that architecture is one of the huge clues. Language is another, that the Dogon have preserved phonetics. Their language is only a spoken language, which is the way we understand archaic language worked. They actually refuse to adopt a written language because their cultural priority is to preserve the archaic form. The way the Dogon language works, you have syllables that represent concepts, and very well-defined concepts. And these are each syllable is the equivalent of a root concept. You can mix and match these syllables together to build words that represent more complicated concepts. So you go to the Maori language in New Zealand, and their complicated words are built on these same phonetics. I can guess, in most instances, what the Maori word means based simply on the phonetics.
Wow, that's incredible. Do the Dogon enjoy any protections or special accommodations by the government?
Not that I know of. Their main protection is distance. They deliberately situated themselves. Okay, when Islam came into North Africa around 1500 BC, the Dogon they were living along the Niger River and seemed to have been threatened with forced conversion to Islam. And at that point, they moved 8 hours across the desert to an escarpment out in the middle of the desert where they eke out a living as onion farmers and producing artworks that are sold to modern visitors and things like that. They raise farm animals. But their protection for their culture is distance and remoteness. Back in ancient times, it looks as if that was a regular trend in the cosmology. There's a group called the Naki or the Naxi who lived along the borderland between Tibet and China. Researchers there understand that the Naxi were originally black Africans, and they preserve a written language that's very much like ancient Egyptian writing, or like a precursor to ancient Egyptian writing. It's also a precursor to ancient Chinese writing, and they have many of the same cosmological ideas the Dogon have. But here we have what looks like a priestly group that was sent out to relocate themselves, reestablish themselves in a remote location, almost as a way of making a safe backup copy of a tradition, as you might with a PC or a thumb drive.
Right.
Even down to specific naming conventions for how these tribes name themselves. You can track them, and you can find evidence of them. Even on Orkney, there are names associated with Skara Brae that follow the naming conventions for these tribes. There are even suggestions that the group that Moses supposedly took out into the desert was one of these priestly groups. If they were, then it's perfectly understandable that they were able to survive in the desert for 40 years, because that's what these groups were trained to do.
I see. Do you think that, for the most part, and this might be jumping tracks big time, for the most part, there's historical evidence for a lot of biblical figures? Jesus, and this kind of ties in at the top of the show I was talking about, but I've been watching all these atheist videos lately, and they're getting in my head. And they, a lot of people talk about whether a lot of these historical figures actually existed, or whether they were kind of amalgams of different people or more symbolic figures. Do you think there was a physical Moses in the Middle East that
these are
the
questions
mythology is rooted in?
These are questions that are very difficult to anchor an opinion about, because how can I explain this? When I was writing the book about ancient China called China's Cosmological Prehistory,
yes,
there are a set of quasi-mythical emperors in China who myths have survived about what their name was and where they were born and what achievements they're credited with having and where they traveled and things like that. The problem is that ancient cosmological words relate to a cluster of meanings the same way that I said the pyramid relates to a cluster of symbolic meanings. Mm-hmm. Every cosmological term doesn't have just one meaning. It has a cluster of discrete meanings. Now you go to these myths about the ancient Chinese emperors, and you discover that all of the key words that are used to define the storyline of the myth, if you look them up in the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, they all have the same phonetic pronunciation. They're all homonyms of each other. These are multiple meanings of a single word. So now, when I look at a myth like that, I say to myself, it's not possible that this could be an historic character, because who could ever have a life that would play out in terms of the multiple meanings of a single term? That doesn't seem reasonable. The problem is that this happens again and again with these figures, that the details of their life, if you understand what the underlying cosmological language is, you realize that everything we're told about this figure plays out as if it's myth. So from the perspective of somebody like me, it might be history, it might be myth, and I don't have a foothold or a footing to be able to say it has to be one or the other. What's worse is that my own life, my own history, has played out in that same way. So if 500 years from now, someone was looking back on me and said, was Laird Scranton a real person or was he a myth? They would have to conclude that they couldn't decide, that it looks both ways. It could be one way or the other. I don't know why that
books.
Yeah, I don't know why that happens, and but what it means is that I can't give an equivocal answer. I mean, I can't give an unequivocal answer as to were these historic or were they mythical.
Right, and that was a sideways question that, but I couldn't help but ask because this topic has been on my mind lately, and so tell me and the audience what your next project is. What is there a name for your next book? Are you that far along in your research, or what shape is taking form?
I have a book at the publishers at Intertraditions right now that'll probably be a year in process with them. The working title is The Plan of the Ancient Cosmology. I don't know what their final title will be for the book. Most often they prefer to set their own title. That's how they can posture a book in the marketplace for who they want to sell it to. And so it's very rare for them to go with the working title that an author has. So I'm not sure what it'll be called. I just know the book will be out sometime early in 2020.
Oh,
There's a second book that I'll likely self-publish in the next few months. It's called Ganesha, the Scientific Symbolism of a Hindu God.
okay.
And that's a book I've been interested in writing for a long time, and draws a lot of connections that I care about. Last year also I published 2 books. One through the publisher on the Maori in New Zealand, and a second book self-published called Seeking the Primordial, that talks about fundamental concepts of creation from a scientific point of view and from the Dogon point of view.
Cool. That's awesome. I think you're busy and you're so prolific in your work, and that's very inspiring. Are you going to be doing any live lectures? Any place where someone can catch you in person this year?
Um, I am scheduled to speak at a conference called LeakCon, LeakCon, that'll be held in Denver, Colorado, the weekend of May 17th. So I'll be there the 17th, 18th, and 19th with my wife, Risa. That's the only definite speaking engagement I have right now. There's a talk of a conference in New York City, but the details aren't certain yet. I don't know if it'll be a 1 or a 2 day conference, and if it'll actually happen or not. Last year, I conducted a day of instruction on the Vassar College campus, and if there's lack of other commitments, I may end up trying to do the same thing this year.
Awesome. Well, as usual, Mr. Scranton, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. These talks that we have are the highlight of not only my day and my week, but it's the highlight of doing this kind of a show where we can talk about this kind of stuff. And maybe you can come back in a few months and talk about your newer book releases, and we can discuss it in detail. And I just want to once again thank you for your time. You were here. If anyone's interested, if you got the bug for this topic, go back to episode 22. Laird and I talk about the Dogon in rich detail in that episode, and I tried really hard to steer clear of that in this episode so that we had new information and new thought-provoking insights. So Laird Scranton, Comparative Cosmologist, author, thank you so much for being here, and you're welcome to come here anytime.
Thank you. I'd be happy to come back anytime. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Laird.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it. That's another awesome episode of Mysterious Forces Live. And no, Professor, I did not forget. Please like and subscribe. I'm pointing down. And hit the little alarm bell so the episode is coming out. And let me look real quick. Doc Skinner, I like you too. Jasmine, Paranormal Hood, Jiggy. I'm going to be in Boston next week, but we'll talk about that later. Satellite, Mincy 4, hello. Let's see, say hello, goodbye, Out of Mind. Thank you all. Lisa F., thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I love you. Tune in tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel. And once again, was that awesome or what? Laird Scranton, wow. He just blows my mind. So thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow.